Lady Beatrice Ashford knelt among the roses, her silk gown stained with dew and dirt, tears streaming down her porcelain cheeks as the sounds of celebration drifted from the manor. Inside, Lord Edmund Blackwell, the man she was to marry in mere hours, danced with her younger sister, their laughter echoing through the gardens like daggers to her heart. The Regency summer night offered no comfort, only witness to her devastation. Then a rustle of taffeta and the Dowager Duchess appeared like an apparition, her silver hair gleaming in the moonlight. She leaned close, her voice steady and conspiratorial. "Dry your tears, child. When we return to that ballroom, you will pretend to be engaged to my grandson, the Duke. Trust me, and your life will never be the same." If you are listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Lady Beatrice Ashford had been raised for one purpose: to marry well and elevate her family's standing among England's elite. At 22, she possessed the refined beauty expected of a lady of her station: golden hair that caught the candlelight, cornflower blue eyes that reflected both intelligence and obedience, and a slender figure that moved with practiced grace through the drawing rooms of London society. Yet beneath the polished exterior lived a young woman who secretly devoured philosophy texts in her father's library and sketched architectural designs in journals she kept hidden beneath her mattress. The Ashford estate in Kent sprawled across verdant hills, its Palladian architecture a testament to old money, carefully preserved through generations. Beatrice's father, Viscount Ashford, had managed the family fortune with prudence, but recent investments in failing shipping ventures had left them vulnerable. The solution, as her mother Lady Margaret repeatedly emphasized, was an advantageous marriage. Lord Edmund Blackwell, heir to the Earl of Thornbury, represented salvation. His family's wealth was legendary, their influence extending to the highest circles of Parliament and the Prince Regent's inner sanctum. Beatrice had met Edmund at a ball the previous season. He was handsome in the conventional sense, dark hair swept back from a high forehead, sharp features that spoke of aristocratic breeding, and an air of absolute confidence that came from never having been denied anything. Their courtship had been brief and formal, consisting of chaperoned walks in Hyde Park and stilted conversations about weather and mutual acquaintances. Edmund spoke often of his family's legacy, his future responsibilities, and the type of wife he required: obedient, decorative, and capable of producing heirs without troubling him with opinions or aspirations of her own. "You understand, Beatrice, that the Countess of Thornbury must be above reproach," Edmund had told her during one of their walks, his tone instructional rather than affectionate. "My mother has set the standard. She manages the household, attends the appropriate social functions, and never contradicts my father in public or private. I expect the same devotion to duty." Beatrice had nodded, suppressing the questions that rose in her throat. What of companionship? What of shared interests or intellectual discourse? What of love? But these were romantic notions, and she had been taught that marriage among their class was a contract, not a fairy tale. Her younger sister, Charlotte, had laughed at her hesitation. "You're so fortunate, Beatrice. Edmund is wealthy and handsome. What more could you possibly want?" Charlotte, at 19, embodied everything their mother praised. She was vivacious without being thoughtful, beautiful without being burdened by introspection. She flirted expertly at every social gathering, her laugh musical and strategic, her compliments calculated to charm. Beatrice loved her sister, but recognized in her a shallowness that sometimes troubled her. Charlotte collected admirers like trinkets, discarding them when more promising prospects appeared. The wedding had been planned for months. The ceremony would take place at St. George's, Hanover Square, followed by a lavish breakfast at the Blackwell London residence. Beatrice's trousseau had been assembled with meticulous care: gowns from the finest modistes, linens embroidered with her soon-to-be initials, jewelry selected to complement the Blackwell family heirlooms she would inherit. Every detail had been orchestrated to reflect the union of two prominent families, a spectacle designed to reinforce their position in society's upper echelons. Yet, as the wedding day approached, Beatrice found herself waking in the night, her heart racing with inexplicable dread. She would stand at her window, looking out over the moonlit gardens, and wonder if this suffocating feeling was normal, if every bride felt this sense of her life narrowing to a single predetermined path. Her mother dismissed her concerns as wedding nerves. "Every woman feels uncertain before marriage, darling. Once you're settled, once you have children, you'll understand your purpose." The week before the wedding, the Blackwells had travelled to the Ashford estate for the final celebrations. A grand ball had been arranged, inviting the cream of county society to toast the upcoming nuptials. Beatrice had dressed with particular care that evening, wearing a gown of ivory silk with delicate gold embroidery, her hair arranged in elaborate curls adorned with pearls. She had descended the staircase to find Edmund waiting in the entrance hall, but his gaze had slid past her to Charlotte, who followed behind in a daring gown of emerald green that set off her auburn hair. Throughout the evening, Beatrice had noticed Edmund's attention wandering. He danced the required dances with her, but his eyes tracked Charlotte's movements across the ballroom. Her sister, for her part, seemed to bloom under his regard, her laughter growing louder, her gestures more animated. When Edmund excused himself to procure refreshments, Beatrice had watched him detour to Charlotte's side instead, the two of them disappearing onto the terrace for what stretched into 20 minutes. "Your fiancé seems quite taken with your sister," observed Lady Pemberton, an elderly neighbour known for her sharp tongue and sharper observations. "One might almost think he's marrying the wrong Miss Ashford." The comment had struck like a physical blow, but Beatrice had maintained her composure, smiling serenely as she made some deflecting remark about Edmund's natural charm. Inside, however, doubt had taken root, spreading through her chest like frost across glass. She told herself she was being foolish, that Edmund was simply being polite to his future sister-in-law. But the unease persisted, growing stronger as the night progressed, and Edmund's preference became increasingly obvious to everyone in attendance. Now, with only hours remaining until the ceremony, Beatrice sat in her chambers as her maid arranged her hair for the pre-wedding dinner. Through the window, she could see guests arriving, their carriages forming a glittering procession up the drive. The Blackwell family crest adorned several of the coaches, and Beatrice recognized the distinctive burgundy livery of the Earl himself. Soon she would descend those stairs, take her place beside Edmund, and smile through countless toasts to their future happiness. The golden cage was closing, and she could feel the bars pressing against her ribs with every breath. The pre-wedding dinner unfolded with all the pageantry expected of such an occasion. The Ashford dining room glowed with hundreds of candles, their light reflecting off crystal and silver, casting dancing shadows across the faces of England's most distinguished families. Beatrice sat at Edmund's right hand, her posture perfect, her smile fixed, while conversation flowed around her like a river she could no longer navigate. The Earl of Thornbury, Edmund's father, held court at the head of the table, his booming voice recounting hunting exploits and political maneuverings. Lady Thornbury, a formidable woman whose beauty had hardened into something more intimidating with age, surveyed the gathering with the air of a general inspecting troops. Charlotte sat farther down the table, positioned strategically between two eligible bachelors, yet her gaze kept drifting to Edmund, and his to her. Beatrice noticed each glance, felt each one like a paper cut, small, sharp, accumulating into something more painful than any single wound. Her mother, seated across from her, was too absorbed in conversation with the Dowager Duchess of Hertford to notice the undercurrents threatening to capsize the evening. The Dowager, an elegant woman in her 70s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, occasionally glanced at Beatrice with an expression that might have been sympathy. After dinner, the guests moved to the ballroom for dancing and further celebration. Musicians played from the gallery, their music filling the space with waltzes and country dances. Edmund led Beatrice onto the floor for the first dance, his hand at her waist, perfunctory rather than possessive. They moved through the steps with mechanical precision, two people performing roles rather than sharing a moment. When the dance ended, Edmund escorted her to the side of the room, bowed formally, and immediately sought out Charlotte for the next set. Beatrice watched them take the floor, her sister's emerald gown swirling as Edmund spun her with an enthusiasm he had never shown his fiancée. Charlotte's laughter rang out, genuine and delighted, and Edmund's face, usually so composed and aristocratic, transformed into something younger, more alive. Around them, guests began to whisper behind fans and gloved hands. Lady Pemberton appeared at Beatrice's elbow, her expression a mixture of scandal and satisfaction. "My dear, this is most irregular. Perhaps you should speak to your mother." But before Beatrice could respond, Edmund and Charlotte had left the dance floor, moving toward the terrace doors. Beatrice felt her feet carrying her forward, some instinct overriding propriety and caution. She followed at a distance, her heart hammering against her corset, her breath coming in short gasps. The terrace was lit by torches, their flames guttering in the summer breeze. Beyond lay the gardens, paths winding between rosebeds and topiary, offering countless shadowed alcoves for private conversations. She found them near the fountain, partially concealed by a marble statue of Diana the Huntress. Edmund held both of Charlotte's hands, his head bent close to hers, speaking with an intensity Beatrice had never witnessed, directed at herself. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The body language told the entire story. The way Charlotte leaned into him, the way his thumb caressed her wrist, the way they stood as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Beatrice must have made some sound, some involuntary gasp or sob, because they turned suddenly, their faces illuminated by torchlight. For a moment all three stood frozen in a tableau of betrayal. Then Edmund released Charlotte's hands and stepped forward, his expression shifting from caught-out guilt to something harder, more calculated. "Beatrice, we need to speak. I can see that you're speaking," Beatrice managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, high and brittle. "Though perhaps you should be having this conversation with me rather than my sister." Charlotte had the grace to look ashamed, her eyes dropping to the ground, but Edmund's face settled into lines of aristocratic disdain. "You're overwrought. Understandable, given tomorrow's ceremony, but you're making assumptions that are unbecoming." "Unbecoming?" The word emerged as something between a laugh and a cry. "You're holding my sister's hands in a darkened garden the night before our wedding, and I'm unbecoming." Edmund's jaw tightened. "Your sister and I were merely discussing. That is, we were—" He trailed off, seeming to realize that any explanation would only deepen the offense. Then his expression changed, hardening into something cold and final. "Actually, Beatrice, perhaps this is for the best. I've been meaning to speak with you about certain concerns." "Concerns?" Beatrice felt the world tilting beneath her feet. "You're a perfectly acceptable woman," Edmund continued, his tone now that of a man conducting business negotiations. "Well-bred, adequately educated, suitable in most respects. But I've come to realize that suitability isn't sufficient for a marriage. There should be passion, connection, genuine affection. Things I've discovered I feel for Charlotte rather than for you." The words struck like physical blows. Beatrice heard Charlotte gasp, saw her sister's hand fly to her mouth, but she couldn't look away from Edmund's face. "You're ending our engagement. Now. Tonight. Better now than after vows have been spoken," Edmund said, and had the audacity to sound reasonable. "Surely you don't want a husband who loves another woman. That would be cruel to us both." "Cruel." Beatrice's voice rose, carrying across the garden. "You've allowed preparations to proceed for months. The church is decorated. The guests are here. My trousseau is packed. And you choose now, the night before our wedding, to inform me that you prefer my sister?" By now, other guests had begun to drift onto the terrace, drawn by the raised voices. Beatrice saw her mother emerge from the ballroom, her face pale with dawning horror. The Earl and Lady Thornbury followed, along with the Dowager Duchess and a growing crowd of society's most influential members. They were all about to witness her complete humiliation. Edmund seemed to recognize his audience. He straightened, his voice carrying to the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the distress this will cause, but I cannot in good conscience proceed with tomorrow's wedding. Lady Beatrice is a fine woman, but I have discovered that my heart belongs to another. To proceed would be dishonest to everyone involved." Lady Margaret pushed through the crowd, her face a mask of fury and panic. "Lord Edmund, you cannot be serious. The scandal, the expense, the arrangements." "I will, of course, compensate the family for any costs incurred," Edmund said smoothly, "and I'm certain Lady Beatrice will recover from this disappointment in time. She's young, she'll find another match." Charlotte finally found her voice, stepping forward with tears streaming down her face. "Edmund, please, this isn't how we planned. Beatrice turned to her sister, the final piece of betrayal clicking into place. "This was planned. You've been conspiring behind my back." Charlotte's silence was answer enough. The crowd erupted in whispers, the sound like wasps swarming. Beatrice saw the faces around her, some shocked, some pitying, some gleeful at the spectacle. Lady Pemberton looked positively triumphant. The Earl of Thornbury appeared apoplectic, his face purple with rage, though whether at his son's behaviour or the public nature of the scandal was unclear. Lady Thornbury's expression suggested she had bitten into something rotten. Beatrice couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't bear another second of their stares. She gathered her skirts and ran, pushing through the crowd, ignoring her mother's calls and the eruption of conversation behind her. She fled through the house, down the servants' stairs, out into the gardens on the opposite side of the manor. She ran until her lungs burned and her slippers were soaked with dew, until she reached the rose garden at the farthest edge of the property, where ancient bushes formed walls of thorns and blooms. There, finally alone, Beatrice collapsed onto a stone bench and let the tears come. Great, wrenching sobs that tore from her chest, releasing the shock and pain and humiliation of the past hour. Her carefully constructed life had shattered like dropped porcelain, and she had no idea how to begin gathering the pieces. The sounds of the party continued in the distance, muffled by hedges and distance, a reminder that the world continued turning even as hers ground to a halt. She didn't know how long she sat there crying into her hands, her elaborate hairstyle coming undone, her ivory gown stained with dirt and tears. Eventually she heard footsteps on the gravel path, slow and measured. She looked up, expecting her mother or perhaps a servant sent to retrieve her, and instead found the Dowager Duchess of Hartfield standing before her, moonlight silvering her hair, her expression unreadable. "Your Grace," Beatrice managed, trying to rise, but the Dowager waved her back down. "Stay seated, child. You've had quite enough performance for one evening." The Dowager settled beside her on the bench, her movements graceful despite her age. For a long moment they sat in silence, the only sounds the distant music and the rustle of roses in the breeze. Then the Dowager spoke, her voice low and conspiratorial. "I have a proposition for you, Lady Beatrice, one that will transform this disaster into your greatest triumph. But you must trust me completely, and you must be brave enough to play a role that will shock everyone who witnessed your humiliation tonight." Beatrice wiped her eyes, confusion cutting through her grief. "I don't understand, Your Grace." The Dowager smiled, and there was something almost wicked in the expression. "My grandson, the Duke of Hartfield, is currently travelling in Scotland on business. He's 30 years old, unmarried, and under considerable pressure from me to find a suitable wife. What if, when we return to that ballroom, you are no longer the jilted fiancée of Lord Edmund Blackwell, but rather the secretly engaged betrothed of one of England's most eligible and powerful peers?" "But that's not true. I've never even met the Duke." "Details," the Dowager said dismissively. "The point is, Edmund Blackwell just publicly humiliated you in front of everyone who matters in society. He expects you to slink away in shame, to become a cautionary tale, to fade into obscurity. Instead, you're going to walk back into that ballroom on my arm and announce that his rejection means nothing because you've been secretly attached to a far superior match all along. You're going to make him look like a fool who gave up a duchess for a mere lady." Beatrice stared at the older woman, her mind struggling to process the audacity of the plan. "But when your grandson returns and denies it—" "He won't," the Dowager interrupted. "Because I'm going to write to him tonight and explain the situation, and because my grandson, despite his many flaws, is a man of honor who will understand that we're rescuing a young woman from undeserved disgrace. He'll play along, at least long enough for you to recover your standing. After a suitable interval, you can have a quiet, mutual parting of ways if you wish. But tonight, right now, you have the chance to reclaim your dignity and turn Edmund Blackwell's cruelty into your liberation." Beatrice felt something stirring in her chest, something that might have been hope or might have been recklessness. The Dowager was offering her a lifeline, however implausible. And what did she have to lose? Her reputation was already in tatters, her engagement destroyed, her sister revealed as a traitor. She could either accept defeat or fight back with the only weapon available, audacity. "What do I need to do?" Beatrice asked, her voice steadier than she felt. The Dowager's smile widened. "First, dry your tears and straighten your spine. Then we return to that ballroom together, and you tell them all exactly what I'm about to teach you to say." The morning after the disastrous ball, Beatrice departed the Ashford estate in the Dowager Duchess's carriage, leaving behind a household in chaos and a scandal that would dominate drawing-room conversations for months to come. Her mother had oscillated between fury at Edmund's betrayal and horror at Beatrice's audacious claim of a secret engagement to the Duke of Hartfield. Her father had retreated to his study with a bottle of brandy, muttering about the unpredictability of women and the death of honor among young men. Charlotte had locked herself in her room, though whether from shame or strategic regrouping, Beatrice neither knew nor cared. The announcement had gone precisely as the Dowager planned. They had returned to the ballroom together, Beatrice's tears dried, her chin raised, her hand resting on the older woman's arm. The Dowager had commanded immediate attention, her voice cutting through the gossip like a blade through silk. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Lady Beatrice's distress this evening stems not from Lord Edmund's defection, but from the difficulty of maintaining a secret that can no longer be kept. My grandson, the Duke of Hartfield, and Lady Beatrice have been privately attached for several weeks. They wished to delay the announcement out of respect for prior commitments, but circumstances have forced our hand. I'm delighted to formally announce their engagement." The ballroom had erupted. Edmund's face had cycled through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been wounded pride. Lady Thornbury had looked as though she'd swallowed a lemon. The assembled guests had buzzed with speculation and excitement. A duke trumped an earl's heir in every possible way, and the narrative had shifted from tragic jilting to romantic intrigue. Beatrice had stood silent throughout, her expression serene, while internally she marveled at her own audacity and wondered what consequences would follow this magnificent lie. Now, as the carriage rolled toward London, the Dowager explained the plan in greater detail. "We'll establish you at Hartfield House in Mayfair. You'll be introduced to society as the Duke's fiancée, and we'll create a narrative that explains the secrecy. Perhaps you met during the season, formed an attachment, but agreed to delay the announcement until after your previous commitment was honorably concluded. Edmund's behavior simply accelerated our timeline." "But what happens when the Duke returns?" Beatrice asked, watching the countryside roll past the window. "Surely he'll be furious at being manipulated into a false engagement." The Dowager's expression turned thoughtful. "Nicholas is complicated. He's brilliant, stubborn, and deeply committed to duty. He's also been avoiding marriage for years because he finds most society women vapid and mercenary. But he's not cruel, and he understands the importance of reputation. I've sent an express letter explaining the situation and requesting his cooperation. I believe he'll agree, if only to spite the Blackwells. There's no love lost between our families." "Why are you helping me?" Beatrice asked suddenly. "You barely know me." The Dowager was silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. "Because 40 years ago, I was you. Different circumstances, but the same essential situation, publicly humiliated by a man who decided I wasn't sufficient for his needs. I had no one to help me, no escape route. I survived, but it cost me years of my life and nearly broke my spirit. When I saw you in that garden last night, I saw my younger self, and I decided that if I had the power to change your story, I would." They arrived in London as afternoon faded into evening. Hartfield House stood in the heart of Mayfair, a magnificent Georgian townhouse with a cream-coloured facade and black iron railings. Inside, the furnishings spoke of wealth accumulated over generations: Aubusson carpets, paintings by old masters, furniture that had been crafted by the finest artisans. The staff, clearly warned of their arrival, greeted the Dowager with deep bows and curious glances at Beatrice. "This will be your home for the foreseeable future," the Dowager announced, leading Beatrice through rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly. "You'll have your own suite, a lady's maid, and access to the library, which I suspect you'll appreciate more than most of the house's other amenities." The library proved to be Beatrice's salvation over the following weeks. It was a 2-story room lined floor to ceiling with books on every conceivable subject: philosophy, science, architecture, history, literature in multiple languages. She spent hours there, reading voraciously, educating herself in subjects that had been deemed inappropriate for a lady's attention. The Dowager encouraged this, often joining her for discussions that ranged from Plato to contemporary politics, treating Beatrice as an intellectual equal rather than a decorative object. "You have a fine mind," the Dowager observed one afternoon, watching Beatrice sketch architectural designs inspired by a book on Palladian principles. "It's been wasted on drawing-room accomplishments and needlework. Nicholas will appreciate that, if nothing else." Society calls began within days of their arrival. The announcement of Beatrice's engagement to the Duke had spread through London like wildfire, and everyone wanted to assess the future Duchess of Hartfield. The Dowager coached Beatrice on how to handle the interrogations disguised as social visits, remain pleasant but vague about the romance, emphasize the Duke's desire for privacy, deflect questions about wedding dates with references to his business in Scotland. Most visitors left satisfied with the narrative, though Beatrice could see skepticism in some eyes, particularly among the sharper society matrons who sensed something amiss. The Dowager also insisted on expanding Beatrice's social circle beyond the traditional drawing-room circuit. She introduced her to a salon hosted by Lady Pembroke, a wealthy widow who gathered artists, writers and intellectuals for weekly discussions. There, Beatrice encountered a world she'd never known existed: women who published essays under their own names, men who valued ideas over pedigree, conversations that challenged rather than reinforced conventional wisdom. It was at one of these salons that she met Dr. Elias Reed. He arrived late, apologizing for an emergency at the hospital where he worked, his dark hair disheveled, his cravat slightly askew. He was perhaps 30, with intelligent grey eyes and a manner that suggested he was more comfortable in a sick room than a drawing room. Lady Pembroke introduced him as one of London's most promising young physicians, known for his work with the poor in the East End and his controversial advocacy for improved sanitation and public health measures. "Dr. Reed, may I present Lady Beatrice Ashford, the Duke of Hartfield's fiancée," Lady Pembroke said with a smile that suggested she enjoyed bringing together interesting people. Elias bowed, but his expression was more curious than deferential. "A pleasure, Lady Beatrice. I hope the Duke appreciates his good fortune, though I confess I'm surprised I didn't realize Nicholas was the marrying type." "You know the Duke?" Beatrice asked, surprised. "We were at Cambridge together, though in different colleges. He studied classics and philosophy. I studied medicine. We've maintained a correspondence over the years, though we don't move in the same social circles." He smiled, and there was something warm and genuine in the expression that made Beatrice's breath catch slightly. "He's a good man, if somewhat too serious for his own good. You'll be good for him, I think." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Beatrice found herself acutely aware of Dr. Reed's presence throughout the evening. He spoke passionately about his work, describing the conditions in London's poorest neighbourhoods with a combination of clinical precision and genuine compassion. He listened when others spoke, asking thoughtful questions, treating the women in the room as intellectual equals. When he asked Beatrice her opinion on a proposed reform to hospital governance, she found herself responding with an honesty she rarely displayed in society settings, and he engaged with her ideas as though they mattered. As the evening ended and guests began to depart, Dr. Reed approached her one final time. "Lady Beatrice, I hope you'll continue attending these gatherings. It's refreshing to meet someone in your position who's interested in matters of substance rather than merely social climbing." "I'm not certain I'm in any position at all," Beatrice replied before she could stop herself. Then, realizing how that sounded, she added quickly, "That is, I'm still adjusting to London society. Everything is rather new." Elias studied her for a moment, and she had the unsettling feeling that he saw more than she intended to reveal. "Well, should you ever wish to see a different side of London, the parts that don't appear in society columns, I'd be happy to serve as a guide, with proper chaperonage, of course. I think you might find it illuminating." The offer lingered in Beatrice's mind over the following days. She mentioned it to the Dowager, who surprised her by encouraging the excursion. "Elias Reed is one of the few genuinely good men I've encountered in society. His work is important, and his character is beyond reproach. If you're curious about his world, you should explore it. Besides," she added with a knowing smile, "it will do you good to remember that there are men who value women for their minds and compassion rather than their dowries and bloodlines." Doge. A week later, Beatrice found herself in Dr. Reed's company, accompanied by the Dowager's companion as chaperone, visiting a charitable hospital in Southwark. The contrast to her usual environment was stark. The smells of illness and poverty, the sounds of suffering, the sight of families crowded into inadequate spaces. But she also witnessed Dr. Reed's skill and compassion, the way he treated each patient with dignity regardless of their station, the way his presence seemed to bring comfort even when his medicine could do little. "This is the reality for most of London's population," Elias explained as they walked through the wards. "While we dance in ballrooms and debate philosophy in salons, thousands live and die in conditions that would horrify us if we allowed ourselves to truly see them. Medicine can only do so much when the fundamental problems are poverty, overcrowding, and lack of sanitation." "What's the solution?" Beatrice asked, genuinely wanting to understand. "Reform, advocacy, education, and funding. People with influence and resources choosing to direct them toward public good rather than private luxury. It's why I value Lady Pembroke's salon. She uses her wealth and position to support causes that matter. And it's why I think you could make a real difference as a duchess if you chose to." The comment struck Beatrice with unexpected force. She'd been so focused on surviving the scandal and maintaining the fiction of her engagement that she hadn't considered what possibilities might exist beyond mere survival. As a duchess, even a temporary, fraudulent one, she would have resources and influence. What might she accomplish if she chose to use them? That evening, back at Hartfield House, Beatrice sat in the library and wrote a letter to the Duke of Hartfield. She'd been composing mental versions for weeks, but had lacked the courage to actually send one. Now, inspired by the day's experiences and Elias Reed's implicit challenge, she put pen to paper. "Your Grace," she began, "I am writing to apologize for the deception that has entangled us both, and to thank you for your apparent willingness to maintain it for the sake of my reputation. I understand this is an imposition, and I want you to know that I do not take your sacrifice lightly. I also want to assure you that I have no designs on making this arrangement permanent. When sufficient time has passed for the scandal to fade, we can part ways with mutual respect and minimal disruption to your life. In the meantime, I promise to comport myself in a manner worthy of your family's name and to use whatever influence this position affords me to do some good in the world. I hope, when we finally meet, that you will find me less objectionable than you might fear. With sincere gratitude and respect, Beatrice Ashford. She sealed the letter and gave it to the Dowager to include with her regular correspondence to Scotland. Then she returned to the library and pulled down a book on urban planning, determined to educate herself on the issues Dr. Reed had raised. If she was going to play the role of Duchess, even temporarily, she would make it mean something. 6 weeks after fleeing her ruined wedding, Beatrice received word that the Duke of Hertford would return to London within the fortnight. The news sent a jolt of anxiety through her carefully constructed composure. The Dowager assured her that Nicholas had agreed to continue the charade, and had even expressed curiosity about meeting the woman who had inadvertently become his fiancée. Still, Beatrice couldn't shake her nervousness. What if he found her lacking? What if he regretted his grandmother's impulsive rescue and decided to expose the deception? "Stop fretting," the Dowager commanded, finding Beatrice pacing the library for the 3rd time that morning. "Nicholas is many things, but he's not cruel. He'll honor our agreement. Besides, I've told him about your work with Dr. Reed's charitable hospital project. That will intrigue him. He has little patience for society ornaments, but great respect for people who use their advantages to benefit others." Beatrice had indeed become deeply involved in Dr. Reed's work. She'd organized a fundraising committee among sympathetic society ladies, leveraging her position as the Duke's fiancée to secure donations from families eager to curry favor with the Hertford name. The project aimed to establish a new wing at the Southwark Hospital, dedicated to treating women and children. Elias had been astounded by her success in raising funds, and their working relationship had evolved into something that felt increasingly like friendship, and perhaps something more, though Beatrice tried not to examine those feelings too closely. "You have a gift for this," Elias had told her during their most recent planning meeting. "You understand how to speak to people in their own language, how to make them feel that supporting this cause elevates them rather than merely depletes their purses. It's a rare skill." The praise had warmed her more than it should have, and she'd found herself looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that went beyond charitable enthusiasm. She admired his dedication, his intelligence, his fundamental decency, and she'd caught him looking at her sometimes with an expression that suggested his feelings might mirror her own. But she was ostensibly engaged to a duke, and he was a physician of modest means. The gulf between them was vast, and growing more complicated by the day. The Duke's return was announced with a grand ball at Hertford House, designed to formally present Beatrice to society as the future Duchess. The Dowager had spared no expense. The house blazed with thousands of candles, musicians filled the ballroom with music, and the guest list included every influential family in London, including, Beatrice learned with dismay, the Blackwells. "They accepted?" she asked the Dowager, staring at the response card with Edmund's family crest. "Of course they did. To decline would be to acknowledge shame, and the Blackwells never acknowledge anything that might diminish their consequence. Besides," the Dowager added with a sharp smile, "I want them here. I want them to see exactly what Edmund gave up when he chose your vapid sister over you." Beatrice had learned that Charlotte and Edmund had indeed become engaged, though the announcement had been met with considerably less enthusiasm than their romance might have anticipated. Society viewed Charlotte as a homewrecker and Edmund as a cad, and the Thornbury family's reputation had suffered accordingly. The knowledge provided Beatrice with a certain grim satisfaction, though it didn't entirely erase the sting of their betrayal. The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth, the air heavy with the promise of summer storms. Beatrice dressed with meticulous care in a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue of her eyes, her hair arranged in an elegant style that suggested both sophistication and confidence. The Dowager's lady's maid had transformed her from the tearful girl in the garden into someone who looked every inch a future duchess. "Remember," the Dowager said, adjusting the diamond necklace at Beatrice's throat, a Hartfield family heirloom that made a clear statement of belonging, "you are not the same woman who was humiliated at your father's estate. You've grown, learned, found purpose. Let that show in how you carry yourself tonight." The receiving line formed early, guests eager to be among the first to meet the mysterious Duke and his even more mysterious fiancée. Beatrice stood beside the Dowager, her heart hammering, waiting for her first glimpse of the man whose name she'd been using for weeks. When he finally appeared, descending the main staircase with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world, she felt her breath catch. Nicholas Ashford, Duke of Hartfield, was not conventionally handsome in the way Edmund had been. He was taller, broader through the shoulders, with dark auburn hair that suggested he spent time outdoors rather than in drawing rooms. His face was all strong lines and sharp angles, saved from severity by intelligent hazel eyes that seemed to assess everything they encountered. He was dressed impeccably in black evening clothes, but he wore them with the ease of someone who didn't particularly care about fashion. He looked, Beatrice thought, like someone who would be equally comfortable in a library or on a battlefield. Their eyes met across the entrance hall, and for a moment everything else faded. Then he was moving toward them, his stride purposeful, and the Dowager was making introductions as though this were a normal meeting between an engaged couple rather than two strangers bound by an elaborate fiction. "Nicholas, may I present Lady Beatrice Ashford, Beatrice, my grandson, the Duke of Hartfield." Nicholas took her hand, bowing over it with perfect formality, but when he straightened, there was a glint of something, amusement, curiosity, in his eyes. "Lady Beatrice, I've heard a great deal about you. I'm pleased to finally make the acquaintance of my fiancée." His voice was deep, cultured, with an undertone of dry humour that suggested he found their situation more entertaining than burdensome. Beatrice found her voice, though it came out slightly breathless. "Your Grace, I'm grateful for your understanding regarding our unusual circumstances." "Unusual is one word for it," he replied, still holding her hand. Then, lowering his voice so only she and the Dowager could hear, he added, "We'll speak privately later. For now, let's give them a show worth watching." And they did. Nicholas played the role of devoted fiancé with an expertise that surprised Beatrice. He kept her close throughout the evening, his hand at her elbow or the small of her back, his attention seemingly focused entirely on her. They danced the first waltz together, and Beatrice discovered that he was an excellent dancer, leading her through the steps with a confidence that made her feel graceful and secure. "You're better at this than I expected," she murmured as they turned across the floor. "At dancing or at pretending to be in love with you?" he asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Both, I suppose. I'm a man of many unexpected talents," he replied. "And for what it's worth, the pretending isn't as difficult as I anticipated. My grandmother was right. You're nothing like the usual society misses who've been thrown at my head over the years." Before Beatrice could respond, she caught sight of Edmund and Charlotte entering the ballroom. Her step faltered slightly, but Nicholas's hand tightened at her waist, steadying her. "I see them," he said quietly. "Breathe. Remember, you're a future duchess. He's merely an earl's heir who made a spectacular error in judgment." The Blackwell party made their way through the crowd, and inevitably their paths converged. Edmund's face was carefully neutral, but Beatrice could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes kept flicking between her and Nicholas. Charlotte looked pale and uncomfortable in a gown that was slightly too elaborate, trying too hard. Lady Thornbury's expression could have curdled milk. "Your Grace," Edmund said, bowing to Nicholas. "Lady Beatrice, congratulations on your engagement." "Thank you, Blackwell," Nicholas replied, his tone pleasant, but with an edge that suggested he knew exactly what had transpired. "Though I understand congratulations are in order for you as well. You're to marry Lady Charlotte, I believe?" "Yes, we're very happy," Charlotte said quickly, her voice too bright. "How lovely," Beatrice said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "I hope you'll be very content together." The subtext was clear to everyone present. Beatrice had moved on to something far superior, while Edmund and Charlotte were left with each other and society's disapproval. Edmund's face flushed slightly, and Beatrice felt a surge of satisfaction that she'd managed to wound his pride as he'd wounded hers. Nicholas seemed to sense her feelings. He drew her closer, his hand warm against her back, and addressed Edmund with perfect courtesy that somehow conveyed absolute dismissal. "If you'll excuse us, I promised Lady Beatrice the next dance as well. I find I'm reluctant to share her attention this evening." They moved away, leaving the Blackwells standing awkwardly in their wake. As they took the floor again, Beatrice felt something loosening in her chest, the tight knot of humiliation and hurt that had lived there since that terrible night. She looked up at Nicholas and found him watching her with an expression of approval. "Well done," he said quietly. "You handled that with perfect grace." "I had an excellent partner," she replied, and meant it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions, dances and conversations. Beatrice found herself genuinely enjoying Nicholas's company. He was witty without being cruel, intelligent without being condescending, and he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on subjects ranging from architecture to social reform. When she mentioned her work with Dr. Reed's hospital project, his interest sharpened. "Elias is doing important work," Nicholas said. "I've been funding some of his research quietly, but he could use more support, particularly from people with social influence. If you're serious about this project, I can help. We could make a real difference." "We?" Beatrice asked, surprised. "Well, we are engaged," he said with a slight smile. "We might as well make use of the fiction to accomplish something worthwhile, unless you'd prefer to simply attend balls and shop for your trousseau." "No," Beatrice said firmly. "I'd much rather do something that matters." "Good," Nicholas replied. "Then we'll discuss it properly tomorrow. For tonight, let's simply enjoy scandalizing society with how well-matched we appear to be." As the evening drew to a close and guests began to depart, Beatrice realized something had shifted. What had begun as a desperate fiction was transforming into something more complex. She'd entered this arrangement expecting to play a role temporarily and then fade back into obscurity. But Nicholas was offering her something different, a partnership, however unconventional, that might allow her to become someone she'd never imagined she could be. Later, as she prepared for bed, the Dowager visited her chambers. "You did beautifully tonight, my dear. And I saw the way Nicholas looked at you. This may have started as a deception, but I don't think it will end as one." Beatrice wanted to protest, to remind the Dowager that this was temporary, that Nicholas was simply being kind. But she couldn't quite make herself say the words, because somewhere during the evening, between the dancing and the conversations and the way Nicholas had stood beside her, as though he truly belonged there, she'd begun to wonder if perhaps the Dowager might be right. The weeks following the ball brought unexpected developments. Nicholas did not return to Scotland as Beatrice had anticipated. Instead, he remained in London, involving himself in her hospital project with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including his grandmother. He attended planning meetings, contributed substantial funds, and used his political connections to secure support from influential members of Parliament. More significantly, he insisted that Beatrice accompany him to these meetings, introducing her as his partner in the endeavour and making it clear that her opinions carried weight. "You have insights that matter," he told her after one particularly productive session with potential donors. "You've actually visited the hospital, spoken with patients, understood their needs. Most of these men are making decisions based on abstract principles. Your practical knowledge makes our case more compelling." Working alongside Nicholas revealed facets of his character that intrigued Beatrice. He was serious and often formal in public, but in private moments he displayed a dry wit and surprising warmth. He listened when she spoke, challenged her ideas respectfully, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on subjects far beyond charitable work. They discussed philosophy, debated political reforms, and discovered a shared passion for architecture and urban planning. Dr. Elias Reed noticed the shift in their dynamic. During one of their hospital visits, he drew Beatrice aside while Nicholas was consulting with the hospital's chief surgeon. "I confess I'm surprised," Elias said quietly. "When your engagement was first announced, I assumed it was purely a society arrangement. But watching you together, there seems to be genuine regard." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm. "The Duke has been very kind." "It's more than kindness," Elias observed, his expression difficult to read. "He looks at you the way a man looks at a woman he values. I'm pleased for you, Beatrice. You deserve someone who appreciates your intelligence and compassion." There was something in his tone that made Beatrice's heart ache. A note of resignation, perhaps even regret. She realized with sudden clarity that Elias had developed feelings for her, and that her growing attachment to Nicholas was causing him pain. The knowledge troubled her, but she didn't know how to address it without making the situation more awkward. The complexity of her feelings became even more apparent when Nicholas proposed an unexpected outing. "I'm traveling to my estate in Derbyshire for a week," he announced over breakfast one morning. "I'd like you to accompany me. With my grandmother as chaperone, of course. I want you to see Hartfield Park, to understand what being Duchess would actually entail." "But we're not truly engaged," Beatrice protested, though her heart had leaped at the invitation. "Surely there's no need." "Humour me," Nicholas interrupted. "Consider it research. If we're going to maintain this fiction convincingly, you should at least know what you're supposedly agreeing to. Besides, I think you'll appreciate the estate. The house was designed by Robert Adam, and the library is even more extensive than the one here in London." The Dowager enthusiastically endorsed the plan, and within days they were travelling north in the ducal carriage. The journey took 2 days, with an overnight stop at a coaching inn where Nicholas secured the best rooms and treated Beatrice with such attentive courtesy that the innkeeper's wife sighed romantically and declared them the handsomest couple she'd ever hosted. Hartfield Park exceeded Beatrice's expectations. The house rose from landscaped grounds like something from a painting, neoclassical architecture in golden stone with soaring columns and perfectly proportioned windows. Inside, the rooms flowed with elegant logic, each space designed for both beauty and function. The library, as promised, was magnificent, a 2-story octagonal room with a domed ceiling painted with classical scenes, shelves filled with thousands of volumes, and comfortable chairs positioned to catch the best light. "This is extraordinary," Beatrice breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. "I thought you'd appreciate it," Nicholas said, watching her with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "You're welcome to spend as much time here as you like during our visit. Consider it yours." Over the following days, Nicholas showed her the estate, the tenant farms where he'd implemented progressive agricultural methods, the village school he'd established, the modernized cottages he'd built to replace crumbling medieval structures. He introduced her to his tenants and staff, who clearly respected and genuinely liked their duke. Beatrice saw a different side of Nicholas here. More relaxed, more at home, more himself. One afternoon, they walked together through the estate's extensive gardens, the Dowager having tactfully remained behind with a book. The day was warm, the air heavy with the scent of roses and honeysuckle. They'd been discussing plans for the hospital wing when Nicholas suddenly stopped walking and turned to face her. "Beatrice, I need to speak with you about something important." Her heart began to race. "Of course. When my grandmother first wrote to me about your situation, I agreed to help because it seemed the honorable thing to do. I expected to maintain the fiction for a few months, then arrange a quiet, mutual separation. But these past weeks, working with you, talking with you, getting to know you, I find I don't want this to be temporary." Beatrice stared at him, unable to process what he seemed to be saying. "I don't understand. I'm saying that I'd like to make this engagement real. I'm asking if you would consider actually marrying me, not as a matter of convenience or reputation, but because I believe we could build something genuine together." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "You can't be serious. You barely know me." "I know that you're intelligent, compassionate, and brave. I know that you care about things that matter and that you're willing to work for them. I know that I enjoy your company more than anyone else's I've encountered. I know that when I imagine my future now, you're in it." He took her hands, his expression earnest. "I'm not claiming to be desperately in love. We're both too practical for such melodrama, but I believe we could have a true partnership, built on mutual respect and shared values. Isn't that a better foundation than the romantic illusions that led you to accept Edmund Blackwell?" The mention of Edmund stung, but Nicholas was right. She had accepted Edmund based on nothing more substantial than social expectation and vague romantic hopes. What Nicholas was offering was different. A conscious choice, a deliberate partnership between equals. It was practical, sensible, and far more appealing than she wanted to admit. "I need time to think," she said finally. "This is unexpected." "Of course," Nicholas replied, releasing her hands. "I don't expect an immediate answer. But I wanted you to know my intentions, to understand that you have a choice. You could return to London, we could stage a quiet separation, and you'd be free to pursue whatever future you wish. Or you could stay, and we could build that future together. Either way, I'll respect your decision." That evening, Beatrice sought out the Dowager, finding her in the drawing room with her embroidery. The older woman looked up as Beatrice entered, her expression knowing. "He's asked you to make it real, hasn't he?" "How did you know?" "Because I've watched him fall in love with you over the past weeks, even if he's too stubborn to call it that. And I've watched you fall in love with him, though you're fighting it because you're afraid of being hurt again." "I'm not in love with him," Beatrice protested, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Aren't you?" The Dowager set down her embroidery. "My dear, I've lived long enough to recognize love in its various forms. What you and Nicholas have may not be the passionate, irrational attachment of youth, but it's something potentially more valuable. Genuine regard, intellectual compatibility, shared purpose. Those are the things that sustain a marriage when passion fades." "But what about Dr. Reed?" Beatrice asked, voicing the confusion that had been troubling her. "I care for him too. I admire his work, his character. Elias Reed is a good man, and you could probably be happy with him if circumstances were different. But ask yourself honestly, when you imagine your future, which man is in it? When you think about the life you want to build, who do you see beside you?" Beatrice closed her eyes, allowing herself to truly examine her feelings. She did care for Elias, his kindness, his dedication, his fundamental decency. But when she imagined her future, it was Nicholas she saw. Nicholas in the library, debating philosophy. Nicholas at the hospital site, planning improvements. Nicholas here at Hartfield Park, walking through gardens and discussing dreams. Nicholas who challenged her intellectually, respected her opinions, and made her feel like a partner rather than an ornament. "Nicholas," she whispered, opening her eyes. "It's Nicholas." The Dowager smiled. "Then I suggest you tell him so. Don't let fear of past hurt prevent you from embracing future happiness. You deserve this, Beatrice. You deserve a man who sees your worth and a life that allows you to flourish." The next morning, Beatrice found Nicholas in the library, reviewing estate documents. He looked up as she entered, his expression carefully neutral, as though bracing himself for rejection. She crossed the room, her heart pounding, and stood before his desk. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'd like to make this engagement real. I'd like to marry you, Nicholas, not because of scandal or convenience, but because I believe we could build something worthwhile together. Because I respect you, admire you, and yes, care for you more than I expected to. Because when I imagine my future now, you're in it too." The transformation in his expression was remarkable. Relief, joy, and something that might have been wonder. He stood, coming around the desk to take her hands. "You're certain? I don't want you to feel pressured or obligated." "I'm certain," she replied, and realized it was true. "This may have started as a deception, but it's become the most honest thing in my life. I choose this. I choose you." Nicholas pulled her into his arms, holding her close, and Beatrice felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness, of coming home. When he kissed her, it was gentle and respectful, a promise rather than a demand. And when they drew apart, both were smiling. "We should probably inform my grandmother," Nicholas said, "though I suspect she already knows." "She definitely knows," Beatrice replied, laughing. "I think she's been planning this since the night she found me crying in the garden." "Then we should thank her," Nicholas said, "for seeing possibilities we were too blind to recognize ourselves." The formal announcement was made a week later, back in London. This time the engagement was real, and the wedding date was set for autumn. Beatrice wrote to her family, informing them of the genuine turn of events. Her mother's response was effusive with relief and social triumph. Her father's was brief but warm, expressing hope that she'd found happiness. Charlotte's letter never came, though Beatrice heard through society channels that her sister's wedding to Edmund had been a subdued affair, attended by far fewer guests than originally anticipated. Dr. Reed received the news with grace, congratulating Beatrice sincerely and assuring her that he hoped they would continue working together on the hospital project. "You're going to be a remarkable duchess," he told her, "and Nicholas is a fortunate man." The final piece of closure came unexpectedly when Beatrice encountered Edmund at a political reception Nicholas had insisted she attend. Edmund approached her during a lull in the proceedings, his expression uncomfortable. "Lady Beatrice, might I have a word?" She considered refusing, but decided she had nothing to fear from him anymore. "Of course, Lord Edmund." They stepped into a quiet corner, and Edmund struggled visibly with what he wanted to say. Finally he managed, "I wanted to apologize for my behavior. The way I ended our engagement was unconscionable. You deserved better." "Yes, I did," Beatrice agreed calmly. "But I've come to see your defection as a gift, though you certainly didn't intend it as such. You freed me to find something far better than what we would have had together." Edmund flinched. "You're happy then, with Hartfield?" "Very happy," Beatrice replied, and realized it was completely true. "Are you happy with Charlotte?" His hesitation was answer enough. "She's not quite what I expected. The qualities I found charming during our courtship have proven less appealing in daily life, and society has not been as forgiving as I'd hoped." Beatrice felt a flicker of pity for him, quickly suppressed. "Then perhaps we've both learned valuable lessons. I hope you find contentment eventually, Edmund, but I need to return to my fiancé now. Goodbye." She walked away without looking back, returning to Nicholas's side. He glanced at her questioningly, and she shook her head slightly, indicating she'd explain later. For now, she simply took his arm and allowed herself to feel grateful for the Dowager's intervention, for Nicholas's unexpected proposal, for the chance to build a life she'd never imagined possible. The golden cage had opened, and she'd chosen to fly towards something far better than what she'd left behind. The autumn wedding took place at Hartfield Park rather than in London, a choice that reflected both Nicholas and Beatrice's preference for meaningful intimacy over social spectacle. The estate chapel, a medieval gem of stained glass and ancient stone, provided the perfect setting. Beatrice wore a gown of ivory silk with delicate lace, far simpler than the elaborate confection that had been prepared for her wedding to Edmund, and infinitely more suited to her actual taste. The Dowager wept openly during the ceremony, and even Nicholas's typically stoic estate manager was seen dabbing at his eyes. The guest list was deliberately small: family, close friends, and the people who had supported them during the transformation from fiction to reality. Dr. Elias Reed attended, bringing with him the chief surgeon from the hospital and several of the nurses who had worked with Beatrice on planning the new wing. Lady Pembroke came with several members of her salon, delighted to witness what she called the most romantic practical arrangement she'd ever encountered. Notably absent were the Blackwells and Charlotte. Though Beatrice's parents attended, her mother still somewhat dazed by her daughter's spectacular social elevation. The wedding breakfast was held in Hartfield Park's long gallery, with its windows overlooking the autumn gilded gardens. Nicholas gave a toast that was characteristically thoughtful, speaking of partnership, shared purpose, and the unexpected ways life could transform disaster into opportunity. Beatrice responded with her own toast, thanking the Dowager for her intervention and Nicholas for his willingness to see beyond social convention to the person she actually was. "I came to this house months ago as a refugee from scandal," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I expected to hide here temporarily, to wait out society's judgment, and then to fade back into obscurity. Instead, I found purpose, partnership, and a future I never imagined possible. I'm grateful to everyone who helped make that transformation real, and I'm especially grateful to my husband, who saw potential in a desperate fiction and chose to make it genuine." The applause was warm and sustained, and when Nicholas kissed her, it felt like a promise renewed, not the desperate deception of their first public appearance, but a conscious choice made by two people who had learned to see each other clearly. After the wedding, they remained at Hartfield Park for several weeks, establishing their life together away from London's scrutiny. Beatrice discovered that marriage to Nicholas was remarkably comfortable. They fell into easy rhythms of shared meals, library time, walks through the estate, and long conversations that ranged across every conceivable subject. Nicholas proved to be an attentive husband, considerate of her needs and genuinely interested in her happiness. The physical aspects of marriage, which Beatrice had approached with some trepidation given her limited education on the subject, turned out to be surprisingly pleasant when undertaken with someone she trusted and respected. More importantly, Nicholas kept his promise about partnership. He consulted her on estate decisions, involved her in his political work, and actively supported her continued involvement in the hospital project. When they returned to London for the winter season, they did so as a united front, attending social functions together, but also hosting gatherings that mixed traditional society with the more intellectual and reform-minded circles Beatrice had discovered through Lady Pembroke's salon. The hospital wing opened the following spring, a bright, modern facility dedicated to women's and children's health. Beatrice had worked tirelessly on every detail, from the layout of the wards to the training program for nurses. Nicholas had contributed not just funds, but also political pressure, securing government support for ongoing operations. Dr. Reed served as the wing's director, and at the opening ceremony he publicly credited the Duchess of Hartfield with making the entire project possible. "When I first met Lady Beatrice," Elias said in his speech, "she was newly arrived in London, uncertain of her place in society. But she possessed something far more valuable than social standing. She had compassion, intelligence, and a genuine desire to make a difference. This facility exists because she refused to accept that her position was merely ornamental. She's proven that nobility of character matters far more than nobility of birth, and she's set an example I hope other women of influence will follow." The applause was thunderous, and Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at Nicholas standing beside her and saw pride and affection in his expression. He took her hand, squeezing it gently, a private gesture of support and celebration. Society's opinion of the Duchess of Hartfield evolved rapidly. What had begun as scandalous gossip, the jilted bride who'd somehow snared a duke, transformed into admiration for a woman who used her position to accomplish meaningful work. Invitations to Hartfield House became highly sought after, not because of social climbing, but because the gatherings there were genuinely interesting, mixing political discussion with charitable planning and intellectual debate. Beatrice occasionally received news of Edmund and Charlotte. Their marriage, by all accounts, was troubled. Charlotte had discovered that being a countess-in-waiting was far less glamorous than she'd imagined, particularly when society viewed her with suspicion and disapproval. Edmund, meanwhile, had learned that the qualities that made Charlotte an exciting mistress made her an exhausting wife. They lived largely separate lives, he in London pursuing political ambitions that never quite materialized, she at the Thornbury estate, reportedly bored and increasingly bitter. Beatrice felt no satisfaction in their unhappiness, only a distant sense of having dodged a bullet. She'd been so focused on the life she was supposed to want that she'd nearly missed the life she actually needed. Edmund's betrayal, painful as it had been, had freed her to discover who she truly was and what she was capable of becoming. One afternoon in late summer, nearly a year after her wedding, Beatrice sat in the Hartfield Park Library with the Dowager, who had come to visit for an extended stay. They were reviewing plans for a new charitable initiative, a school for girls from working-class families, designed to provide education beyond basic literacy. "You've accomplished remarkable things," the Dowager observed, setting down the proposal. "Far more than I imagined when I found you crying in that garden." "I had an excellent teacher," Beatrice replied, smiling at the older woman. "You showed me that disaster could be transformed into opportunity, that I didn't have to accept the role society assigned me. You gave me the chance to choose my own path." "I merely opened a door," the Dowager said. "You're the one who walked through it and built something extraordinary on the other side. I'm proud of you, my dear, and I'm grateful that my impulsive rescue plan turned into something so much better than I'd hoped." Nicholas entered the library, having just returned from a meeting with his estate manager. He crossed to Beatrice, dropping a kiss on the top of her head before settling into the chair beside hers, small gestures of affection that had become natural between them. "What are you two plotting now?" "A school for girls," Beatrice explained, showing him the plans. "We're thinking of establishing it in the village, using the old rectory building. It would provide education in practical skills as well as academics, preparing them for meaningful work rather than just domestic service." Nicholas studied the proposal, his expression thoughtful. "It's ambitious. It will also be controversial. There are plenty who believe educating working-class girls above their station is dangerous, but I think it's exactly the kind of project we should undertake. Let's discuss it with Dr. Reed and Lady Pembroke. Build a coalition of support before we announce it publicly." "We," Beatrice repeated, warmth flooding through her. "I love that you always say we, because that's what we are," Nicholas replied simply. "Partners in everything." Later that evening, Beatrice stood at the window of their private sitting room, looking out over the estate as the sun set behind the hills. Nicholas came to stand beside her, his arm around her waist, and they watched the day fade into twilight together. "Do you ever regret it?" Beatrice asked quietly. "Taking on a pretend fiancée who became a real wife? Your life would certainly be simpler without me." "Simpler, perhaps," Nicholas agreed, "but infinitely less interesting, less meaningful, less happy. You've transformed not just your own life, Beatrice, but mine as well. You've shown me that duty and passion don't have to be separate, that I can be both a responsible duke and a man who works for genuine change. You've made me better than I was." "We've made each other better," Beatrice corrected, leaning into his embrace. "That's what partnership means." She thought back to that terrible night in her father's garden, when her carefully planned life had shattered, and she'd believed herself ruined beyond recovery. She remembered the Dowager's whispered proposition, the audacious lie that had saved her reputation, the unexpected journey from pretense to reality. She thought of Edmund and Charlotte, trapped in a marriage built on infatuation and betrayal, and felt only gratitude that she'd been freed from that fate. "I was crying in the garden," she said softly, "certain my life was over. And then you came into it, and everything changed. Not the way I expected, not the way I'd planned, but so much better than anything I could have imagined." "The best things often are," Nicholas replied, turning her to face him. "Unexpected, unplanned, but absolutely right. I love you, Beatrice. Not because I'm supposed to, not because of duty or obligation, but because you're extraordinary, and I'm fortunate enough to have recognized it. I love you too, Beatrice said, the words coming easily now, though they'd been difficult at first. Thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you for offering me a partnership instead of a cage. Thank you for choosing me. Always, Nicholas promised, and kissed her as the last light faded from the sky. In the years that followed, the Duchess of Hartfield would become known throughout England for her charitable work, her advocacy for women's education, and her partnership with a duke who valued her mind as much as her position. The hospital wing would expand into a full medical complex. The girls' school would inspire similar institutions across the country, and Hartfield Park would become a gathering place for reformers, intellectuals, and anyone who believed that privilege carried responsibility. But on that summer evening, standing in the library of the house that had become her true home, Beatrice simply felt grateful. Grateful for the Dowager's intervention, for Nicholas's unexpected proposal, for the chance to build a life of purpose and meaning. She'd been planted in soil she never chose, but she'd bloomed into something far more beautiful than the decorative flower she'd been raised to be. The golden cage had opened, and she'd discovered that freedom wasn't about escaping constraints, but about choosing which ones to embrace. She'd chosen partnership over independence, duty over ease, purpose over comfort. And in making those choices, she'd found something she'd never expected in her arranged marriage to Edmund. She'd found genuine happiness, built on respect, shared values, and love that grew deeper with each passing day. As Nicholas often said in his speeches advocating for social reform, we cannot always choose our circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them. Beatrice had responded to disaster by building something extraordinary, and every day she woke up grateful for the chance to continue that work beside a partner who valued her for exactly who she was. The girl who'd cried in the garden was gone, replaced by a woman who'd learned to see crisis as opportunity, to transform fiction into truth, and to bloom exactly where she'd been planted, not in the life she'd planned, but in the one she'd chosen, which turned out to be so much better. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which part resonated with you most and where in the world you're listening from. Your support helps me continue creating stories that inspire and entertain. Thank you for being part of this journey.